Olga Alicia Paz was a 31-year-old woman living in Seguin, Texas, a small city with a close-knit community and a mixture of suburban and rural settings. She was a wife and a mother, balancing the responsibilities of family life while trying to maintain the ordinary rhythms of work, community, and parenting that so many people in their early 30s navigate. On or around March 22, 2010, she was seen alive that morning, beginning what should have been a normal day. By later that same day, she was discovered brutally stabbed to death inside her home. The violence of her death contrasted sharply with the image of her as a devoted wife and mother, someone rooted in family and routine, and the case immediately shocked the community of Seguin, which was not accustomed to crimes of such brutality. Her husband was quickly ruled out as a suspect, a fact that narrowed the field but also left investigators with fewer obvious leads. The Texas Rangers, who are often called into difficult or unsolved homicides across the state, added her case to their cold case listings when local leads ran dry, underscoring both the difficulty of the investigation and the mystery that surrounded her death. To analyze this case in detail requires considering the broader context of violent crime in small Texas communities, the specific dynamics of domestic space where most female victims of homicide are found, the possible motives and circumstances that might have led to such a brutal attack, and the investigative challenges that make a case remain unsolved more than a decade later. When a young woman is murdered inside her own home, investigators typically begin with the people closest to her, especially intimate partners, relatives, or close friends. In this instance, the husband was evaluated and cleared. That in itself is significant, because spousal homicide is tragically common, and often the first scenario to be eliminated or confirmed. By ruling him out, investigators were faced with the less common but still serious possibility of either an acquaintance homicide or a crime committed by a stranger who had access to the home. Her last known movements that morning become critical. She was last seen alive in the morning hours, and sometime afterward, the crime occurred. That window of time, when narrowed by investigators, would have provided the first framework for potential suspects. Neighbors, family members, co-workers, and anyone who may have been scheduled to interact with her that day would likely have been interviewed. The method of her death, described as brutal stabbing, points toward a personal and violent attack. Stabbing homicides are often viewed as crimes of passion, or crimes where anger and proximity play a large role. Unlike firearms, which allow for distance, stabbing requires physical closeness and repeated contact. That may suggest that her killer had either a personal motive or an intense rage, though it is also possible in certain scenarios, such as burglary or opportunistic crimes, where a knife happens to be the weapon available. The absence of an identified perpetrator over many years suggests either that the killer left little forensic evidence, or that the evidence was not sufficient to point conclusively to an individual. DNA, fingerprints, and other trace evidence would likely have been collected at the scene. If the crime scene was the home itself, investigators would have examined forced entry points, missing items, and any signs of struggle. A forced entry would support the hypothesis of a burglary or home invasion gone wrong, whereas lack of forced entry could imply that the victim knew the killer or felt comfortable enough to allow them inside. If she was found during daytime hours, the killer either acted brazenly during daylight or timed the attack in a narrow window when they knew she would be home alone. The fact that the case still appears on the Texas Rangers cold case site means investigators either exhausted local leads or could not generate enough evidence to move forward with charges. Cold cases like this often stall due to a combination of circumstantial evidence, lack of witnesses, and no clear suspect pool. Seguin, being a relatively small town, may not have had the volume of violent crime that creates numerous suspects, but it also may have had fewer resources to dedicate long-term to one investigation once immediate leads ran dry. The Rangers' involvement provided additional investigative capacity and the symbolic weight of Texas' storied law enforcement branch. But even with that, the lack of resolution indicates that this was a particularly difficult homicide to untangle. Examining the possible scenarios provides more insight. One possibility is that Olga was targeted by someone she knew outside her immediate family circle. This could involve acquaintances, co-workers, or even neighbors. The brutality of the stabbing might point toward someone with a personal grievance, a domestic dispute with extended family, a soured friendship, or someone harboring resentment could theoretically escalate to violence. However, after interviews and investigations, if law enforcement did not find compelling suspects in her immediate circle, the case may have shifted toward other possibilities. Another possibility is that she fell victim to a crime of opportunity. Home invasions or burglaries sometimes turn into homicides when the victim confronts the intruder. If the crime happened in daylight, it is possible someone believed the home was empty, entered to steal, and then attacked upon realizing she was there. In such cases, the offender may or may not have left trace evidence, depending on their level of preparation and panic. Stranger homicides are more difficult to solve because the link between victim and offender is absent. In cases where the victim and offender are not connected socially or familially, law enforcement must rely heavily on forensic evidence or witness accounts to bridge the gap. If no neighbors saw suspicious individuals, vehicles, or activity, and if no DNA linked to known offenders was recovered, investigators would have found themselves with few pathways forward. Over time, without breakthroughs, the case would move into cold status. The timing of the homicide in 2010 is also relevant. By then, DNA testing was widely in use, but databases like CODIS were still growing. If DNA was collected but did not match anyone in the system, it would have been stored for future reanalysis. Advances in forensic genealogy in the 2010s and beyond have led to new ways of identifying suspects by linking DNA to family trees, but such methods require the presence of viable genetic material and the resources to pursue complex genealogical investigations. Her case being unsolved may mean either the DNA was not sufficient in quantity or quality, or that such genealogical methods have not yet been applied. Looking at victimology is essential. Olga was a 31-year-old woman, wife and mother. Victims of homicide in their early 30s who are not engaged in high-risk lifestyles tend to be killed either by intimate partners, family members, or acquaintances. The lack of an identified perpetrator after ruling out the husband makes the case more unusual. It suggests either an acquaintance who avoided detection or a random offender. Given that the Rangers still seek information, it is likely they believe someone in the community has knowledge that could unlock the case. The brutality of stabbing is a striking detail. In homicide research, stabbing deaths often involve multiple wounds, sometimes overkill, which may indicate either personal rage or panic. If investigators determined the wounds were excessive beyond what would be necessary to incapacitate, that would support the theory of a personal grievance. If instead it was one or two lethal strikes, it could reflect a more controlled intent, possibly consistent with a burglary turned deadly. Without the autopsy details, one can only hypothesize, but the nature of the wounds would have been key evidence for investigators in understanding the psychology of the crime. The emotional toll on the family and community must also be considered. For her husband, being ruled out meant enduring suspicion during the early investigation, as spouses nearly always are scrutinized. For her children, the loss was profound, leaving them without a mother and with unanswered questions about who caused it. For Seguin, the case became a haunting reminder that violent crime can strike anywhere, even in seemingly quiet neighborhoods. The Texas Rangers' listing of the case continues to keep her memory alive, but also highlights the lack of closure. From an investigative perspective, cold cases often hinge on time. Witnesses who were reluctant at the time may eventually come forward. Forensic techniques improve. Offenders who once evaded detection may surface through other crimes or confessions. In some cases, a casual statement made years later to a friend, a cellmate, or an acquaintance triggers a new lead. In others, technological leaps such as advanced DNA testing reopen doors that once seemed closed. In Olga's case, the presence of a cold case listing means investigators remain open to new information. It also signals that they may have retained biological or physical evidence that can be reevaluated in the future. The timeline of her final day is another crucial piece of the puzzle. Being last seen in the morning suggests she may have interacted with family members or others before the attack. If she had errands or appointments, investigators would have tracked those. If she was home alone, that narrows the window of opportunity for the offender. The question then becomes how the offender knew she was available and vulnerable at that time. Random crimes do occur, But killers who enter a home in daylight often either know the victim's schedule or take extraordinary risks. This raises the possibility that someone in her orbit had knowledge of her movements. Seguin's geography and demographics also matter. It is located not far from San Antonio, within commuting distance but still its own smaller community. This proximity means offenders could potentially travel in from outside areas, commit a crime, and vanish without drawing local suspicion. At the same time, small-town networks mean gossip and information travel quickly, and it is hard for someone within the community to commit such an act without whispers emerging. That balance of insider and outsider possibilities would have been part of the investigative calculus. A deeper analysis of stabbing homicides in Texas around that time may also provide context. Many female victims of stabbing are attacked by men they know, often during domestic disputes. Stranger stabbings are relatively less common, though not unheard of. If local law enforcement canvassed for similar cases in the region and found none, it may suggest this was not the work of a serial offender, but rather an isolated incident. On the other hand, if other unsolved stabbings of women in their homes were reported in nearby counties, the possibility of a pattern would emerge. The fact that only her case is highlighted suggests it may have been a standalone tragedy. Her age and role as a mother add to the tragedy. Many victims of unsolved homicides are younger women, often caught in sudden acts of violence. The absence of justice prolongs grief for families. In analyzing her case, one must acknowledge the void left behind, not only in legal terms, but in the daily lives of those she loved. The absence of closure means anniversaries, birthdays, and milestones pass with unanswered questions. Each year that the case remains on the Rangers list is a reminder of unfinished justice. The broader question becomes why certain cases defy resolution despite best efforts. In Olga's case, the killer either executed the crime in a way that avoided detection, or circumstances of the scene and investigation left too many gaps. Perhaps the killer fled immediately, leaving few traces. Perhaps the neighborhood lacked surveillance cameras that are now ubiquitous, but were rare in 2010. Perhaps crucial witnesses were unavailable or unobservant. Cold cases often result from a confluence of such factors, rather than a single investigative failure. From a criminological perspective, analyzing potential offender profiles can also shed light. If the offender was a stranger, they may have been transient, someone passing through, or someone living on the margins of society. Such individuals may evade detection because they leave few records and are not rooted in one place. If the offender was an acquaintance, they may have hidden their crime through silence and normalcy, blending back into the community. The act of stabbing, however, suggests someone capable of intense violence, whether planned or impulsive. That capacity raises the possibility that the offender committed other violent acts, potentially leaving a trail elsewhere. Investigators often revisit cold cases when offenders are arrested for other crimes. If someone arrested later for a violent offense had ties to Seguin in 2010, that would merit review. The Rangers' involvement means such cross-checking likely occurred, but still no match surfaced. This reinforces the possibility that the offender either has not reoffended or has not been caught. Over time, public memory of such cases can fade, but official cold case listings keep them visible. For Olga's case, the Rangers' site serves both as a repository of information and as an appeal to the public. The hope is that someone who knows something but has remained silent will eventually speak. Fear, loyalty, or shame can suppress witnesses, but time has a way of eroding barriers. A single tip could change everything, but until then, the case remains suspended between memory and mystery. In analyzing her case, one must also weigh the symbolic role it plays in the broader fight against unsolved homicides. Each unsolved murder represents not just an individual tragedy, but also a gap in the justice system. It highlights the limits of forensic science, the challenges of human investigation, and the persistence of evil that sometimes evades accountability. Olga's story, of a young mother taken violently inside the supposed safety of her home, resonates because it strikes at the heart of human vulnerability. Home is meant to be a place of safety, yet hers became the site of horror. The unanswered questions linger. Who knew her well enough to know her schedule? Who would have had the motive to harm her? Who was willing to risk entering a home in daylight to commit such violence? Why has no one stepped forward with information that could resolve the case? The silence around those questions is as chilling as the crime itself. In analyzing her story, one is left with both the facts of the crime and the enduring absence of answers. Ultimately, the case of Olga Alicia Paz remains emblematic of the challenges of homicide investigation in smaller communities. Despite professional investigators, community concern, and the passage of time, the killer has not been identified. Her story persists in the cold case files, a testament to the persistence of mystery and the hope for eventual resolution. For her family, the loss is permanent, but the possibility of justice remains as long as the case is not forgotten. The brutality of her death, the youth of her age, and the unresolved questions ensure that her case will continue to be revisited until either evidence or testimony brings the truth to light.